The duration of our presenters talking and the moderated session. Welcome to the Cultural Institutions and Artifacts session. My name is Kimberly Rose, and I am the Preservation Manager for the CREG Group, working on the Resilient Heritage Trinidad and Tobago project. It is my honor to serve as moderator during this session. I do want to remind those of you who are in person to hold your questions until the end. Those of you online, feel free to type them in, and they will be conveyed to me at the appropriate time. Our first speaker for this session is Dr. KHAW. He received his doctorate in archaeology from Leiden University in 1987 and is currently affiliated with the Faculty for Archaeology. His work has led him into several positions, including the president of the International Association for Caribbean Archaeology and the senior regional representative for the Caribbean in the World Archaeological Congress. He is currently directing 3 youth and science programs, all of which he created. His presentation here today will focus on these programs and their approaches to community engagement regarding heritage and climate issues. The emphasis will fall into identifying both the successful and not successful context of engagement and how to achieve more effective results for building awareness. Our second speaker is joining us virtually. Her name is Corinne Wegner, and she serves as the director of the Smithsonian Cultural Rescue Initiative, or SCRI. SCRI is an outreach program for the preservation of cultural heritage in crisis situations and has previously extended programs and projects into areas such as Haiti, Iraq, Syria, Nepal, the Bahamas, and Ukraine. She also fulfills the role of co-chair in the Heritage Emergency National Task Force, which delivers an annual Heritage Emergency and Response Training course. Her presentation today is focused on the work of SCRI and how it strives to integrate conservation of cultural heritage into disaster risk management planning. It also looks into how climate change, as a challenge, is calling for better training and coordination among first responders, disaster planners, and cultural heritage professionals. And with that, Dr. KHAW, the podium is yours.
Thank you, Kim. And following up on Mr. Kumar Singh's first pitch, it's time to take off the jacket, roll up our sleeves, and start talking some business here. Let's get down to work. And I would like to thank Mr. Kumar Singh for the presentation earlier. It was quite to the point. As a preface to what I'm going to try to talk about today, I want to make one thing very clear. We can make all of the laws and policies we like, but if we don't elevate the community appreciation, awareness, and valuization of our heritage, we will lose it. And there's where we've got to find that balance between the science and the communities. Our goal, and we're going to start here. Oh, I have this thing. Up is down and down is up. Nope. The other up. Hold on. Oh, this one.
Yes, the big button.
Okay, heritage is about people, and its development is about reconciling the past within the context of the present while preparing for the future. By having scientific research, community education, and cultural resource management serve the needs of both the resident population and professionals, particularly in these times of climate change. It's a two-way communication. Professionals share new data and scientific insights, often unfamiliar to the residents, while residents share traditional insights and values, which may also include claims to ownership of the exhibition formats for those traditions. And that's a point I'm going to discuss a little bit later. In the Netherlands Caribbean, we have been helping our youth to now be both the residents and professionals and future professionals for this balance between science and community. I'm going to discuss specifically in more detail 3 foundation programs that we have on St. Maarten, Saba, and Bonaire, but I do want to give you a general background in the Netherlands Caribbean of what kind of heritage programs we have. In Curaçao, we have what was called the AINA, that became the NAM, National Archaeological Anthropological Museum. In St. Eustatius, we have the St. Eustatius Center for Archaeological Research, CECAR. On Bonaire, the Bonaire Archaeological Institute, St. Maarten Archaeological Institute, Saba Archaeological Center, and the Aruba Archaeological Museum. These are the key institutions that are doing the work for cultural heritage management and cultural heritage research. The goal of this presentation, though, is to go beyond just saying the youth of the future. That's a very commonly spoken phrase. It's an inspirational phrase. But we have to realize it needs more meat than just a statement. The youth are the future. The youth need to be educated, need to be made aware, need to be enlightened to their own perspectives of their heritage. So rather than critically compare, in this case, I have critically compared various developing heritage and archaeology programs, the 3 islands I just mentioned, to see what is working and to see what is not working, and how we can be more effective in our development of heritage on the islands, and considering, in this case, the increasing impacts of climate change. Now, 2 of the islands I'm not going to discuss as much, but they are very active in heritage preservation as well as climate change issues. Aruba, with its earliest autonomy from the kingdom in '86, they have a great deal of research and work being done. I have done less work there, and so I'm not going to present their work for them, but I do want to mention the strides that they have made. In Curaçao, in 1968, we got the first Archaeological Anthropological Institute of the Netherlands Antilles. Now, this institute was basically a very small initiative of a man of Lebanese descent, a Curaçaoan of Lebanese descent, Mr. Eddie Ayubi. And it started off with basically trying to research and find out what they could on the different islands. This is at a time when the Netherlands Antilles consisted of all 6 islands that I mentioned earlier. And so I was part of some of the early staff for the AINA. The AINA research did always involve the local population. AINA came, with the AINA came an increased archaeological research on all of the islands. It was a Netherlands Antilles government institution, and therefore was focusing itself on all of the 6 islands of the Netherlands Antilles. But these projects were relatively small scale. There was an emphasis where we would go to the Department of Public Works to find labor for these projects, but we would try to focus on media and educating the public as these projects were going on. In this time period with AINA, we also then started to get more authority appropriated from the government to monitor when international groups would come in, so that we could have a local community voice in development plans by the outside archaeologist. AINA promoted the intrinsic value of ethnographic objects. Private ethnographic collections were assessed into the AINA collections, and archaeological excavations were focused on locations of interest to the local residents. One of the things that I found early on is that when scientists come in for archaeological research on an island, they have their own agenda. They have what they think is important to research or what they think should be investigated. But if you ask the community, it can sometimes be something completely out of left field that they never thought of. I would come and say, oh, we've got these archaic sites, 4,000-year-old sites, very important sites. And they're saying, yes, but there's this community in the 1920s that used to live up in the hills, and that's what we want you to study. And right now, the point is, that is what we should study, because if the community says we want you to study it, you should be studying it. It doesn't mean we can't keep studying the scientific interest, but it means we must study the community interest. And that link between those researchers and those whose heritage is researched is explained in local language and made relevant into daily life. AINA evolved into the NAM in 1998, and then it changed its status from a government institution to a government-sponsored foundation, sponsored specifically through the Curacao government. So it lost its emphasis on the bigger picture of all 6 islands and started to do more focus on Curacao itself. However, they also were increasing their educational programs and community engagement programs. And with this shift, they actually even changed the name to the National Archaeological Anthropological Memory Management Foundation, and that reflected the fact that they were focusing now on collections management, on data gathering from community. It was a situation where the archaeological research was becoming less and the collections management was becoming more. So this is the model of how Curacao was developing with its heritage programs. On St. Eustatius in 2000, an archaeologist named Grant Gilmore started what was called the St. Eustatius Center for Archaeological Research, CCAR. Now, this was a field school-oriented research station based on Colonial Williamsburg and the Museum London, both of which Grant had worked at and studied at. Miss Misha Spanner was early on with the program, and she continues to work with the museum and community groups. The thing about the Statia model is that they use what we call a field school participant model. Their emphasis was, in order to get the archaeology done, we're going to offer to outside institutions, touristic or otherwise type of institutions, whereby people pay to come conduct research in the Caribbean. So the research gets done, and most often the research is done at a research quality level that is acceptable, it's professional. The problem is, it's not local researchers. The problem is it's people from outside who have paid to come and do research on the island. And there was where we ran into the gap with the Statia model. More recently, there has been a case on St. Eustatius where there was an inappropriate research of an African burial ground, an enslaved African burial ground. In this case, the archaeology was well done. The problem is the archaeologists chose not to communicate with the community about it. And when it was found out later that an enslaved African burial ground was being dug up and 69 skeletons had been removed by a full Dutch archaeological team, and this was private consultants, it was not a university, then there was outrage. There were actual protests. And so they created a commission. I was assigned chair of this commission. We brought 15 individuals together from across the region, anthropologists, archaeologists, historians. And what we had to do was sort of evaluate what was the nut of the problem. Why did this thing happen like this? And basically, we had criticism at all levels. The first level was what we called the blind eye approach. And that was that government said, we don't know anything about archaeology, so we're going to turn it over to this NGO. And they're going to handle it, CCAR. We're going to turn it over to CCAR. Now, CCAR is primarily expats who have a passion for history and love Statia, but they don't have a lot of scientific staff. And so when CCAR was given the responsibility to monitor these researches, they said, well, we'll just turn it over to the researcher. So essentially what happened is the researchers are monitoring themselves. And that was the root of the problem. And so we had to make that in writing clear so that everyone would understand this was a systemic problem. It wasn't just a one-on case. So that is the Statia model, is this field school participant model. On Bonaire, where I started the first of 3 foundations in 2003, the Bonaire Archaeological Institute, called BONAI, we created this to emphasize and focus on local youth. The target group is 14 to 18 years old, and it's all of the high schools. Of course, in Bonaire, they only have 1 high school, but in all of the access that we can get to this age group, and we even had kids who are not in school, which is an important point because we've got kids of that age who still have the capacity to go further, but they just may not have the economic means to be in school or such. But with Bonaire, we've got a very small population, 15,000 people. So you have to deal with limited resources, you've got limited access to funds and such. We have done several cooperation projects on Bonaire with particularly Leiden University, of which, as you heard, I'm affiliate. But as well, more recently, we've been doing work with Harvard on DNA studies and several other universities and institutions. So the youth involvement for the Bonaire model, is involvement at all levels of research. The kids decide, we decide through the program what we want to research. They are participatory in how we're going to research it. Of course, my job is to give guidance for scientific method and approach, but their job is to learn how to do these things. And throughout the projects, and this is not just for the Bonaire project, but for all 3 of them, I've emphasized media communication by the kids, about the kids, for the communities. So the kids, we get cameras, we make TV commercials. I'm going to show you one at the end of my presentation. We make these little TV commercials. The kids make the commercials themselves. And so they are trying to express their opinion to the community. In the case of Bonaire, we also had a very unique and exciting opportunity. We discovered a World War II military base way out in the bush. We did archaeology out there, but then the kids said, yes, but this should be a park. This should be part of our tourism as well. And so we got funding through Mondrian funds and some other agencies, and we were able to make a heritage park about this World War II military base. Now, the theme of the park isn't the U.S. military. The theme of the park is, what impact did the U.S. military have on the Bonairean society? And we talk about children born to local women. We talk about women who left with these men when they left. We talk about the introduction of technologies, changing diets. All of this is part of the impact of the World War II period. Trinidad and Tobago, particularly Trinidad, was the Southern Command. Nelson Island is a good example of that. But it just shows that the World War II period for the broader Caribbean region is an extremely important period for us to understand. Introduction of technologies also in our islands, where we speak Papiamento, it also included introduction of new words. When an icebox, a refrigerator, was introduced into the islands, it was called a Frigidaire. When cameras were introduced, they were called Kodaks, because those were the brands that were being introduced. So it has not only affected our diet and our technological abilities, but even language and children born to local women, which is a big factor we looked at. So one of our projects with the Bonaire group was we wanted to do environmental relationship projects. Now, at this time, we weren't always thinking about climate change itself per se as that, but we realized how important the relationship between culture and nature is, how fundamental the relationship between culture and nature is. So what we did, we identified a dead beach, KHAW Beach it's called. And at KHAW Beach, we had it was just sand. There's nothing living out there. What the kids did, and it included getting the permits, researching proper cements for the underwater constructions, all these things they had to learn. And then we built, and you can see to the left there, we built this statue of cultural iconic objects, artifacts. And then we sunk that out in this bay, and this was in 2007. Now that statue is completely covered with coral. It's got a whole colony of fish living around it. It is a tourist thing where people snorkel out to see it. But it's the kids who came up with the idea to do this and did it. And again, we've got to not only talk to them, we have to listen to them. Bonai was started 20 years ago. Where are we today? I am very proud to say that last year, well, let me just step back a second. 20 years ago, these were 14 to 18-year-olds. That means they're 34 to 38-year-olds now. They are doctors, they are lawyers, they are politicians, they are members, decision-making members in the community. One of our former Bonai students is the head of monuments and archaeology in the government. So they have elevated themselves, and the hope of Bonai was with an awareness and a sense of value for cultural heritage that they carried with them into those decision-making positions. So I stepped aside, and the entire board is now Bonarian. The board of directors is not only all Bonarian, but they're all former Bonai students. So that program has now become itself a Bonaire, completely Bonaire project. And that was the long-term goal. So this one has done it very well. We're doing continued research. We did a big pre-Columbian study with Leiden University at the Amboina site, where we uncovered a remarkable, so I don't want to get too much into the archaeology because it distracts, but we did uncover 14 house structures where we could see the post of the roundhouses, and within these 14 house structures, 7 house structures and 14 burials. Inside the houses, we were able to confirm that an Amerindian burial technique, and we're talking about 1000 to 1200 AD, was to bury the dead in the floor of the house. This has been ethnographic analogy, but we were able to establish it archaeologically. And so the thing is when we do these scientific investigations and the kids are part of the team, not only do we do it in the media, but they go home and they talk to their parents and they talk to their friends and they talk to their aunts and uncles. And that's how information gets from the research into the community. And the youth are one of the best ways to get it out there, to have it spread through. In Samatan, where I am now, we started in 2005. We were going wonderful, full tilt, doing a lot of projects. I'll show you some here in a minute. But what really happened to us was the devastation of Hurricane Irma in 2017. Hurricanes Irma and Maria flattened our island. Everyone was affected. But 2 weeks, and that was as soon as the police would allow us to get access to the building, the archaeological center. You see the top there? That's what it looked like before. 2 weeks after, even though these kids had their own homes destroyed, I too, but even though they were going through the trauma of post-Irma, they came out and rescued the archaeological collections that were in the ruins of the archaeological center. It was kind of like doing archaeology of the archaeology center, basically, because the roof went and the walls collapsed and all the shelves were on the walls and everything got buried like this. So we had to remove it. But those kids came out from their own misery and helped to do this. We now, in 2019, were able to get a new facility, and so we are moving forward. Our activities include weekly lectures, regular lab and field work, All of the local high schools are involved. In St. Martin, I think we have 5 high schools. We have several private high schools that are also involved. And then the government gives us a stipend that we can operate. That's our facility, our rent, our water, electric, and our internet bill. But for projects, we have to go outside. And that's where we look for funds for specific projects outside. So again, it's about having the kids learn how to write project proposals and who do you approach and how do you approach who. That's a very important thing. It's not just who you approach, it's how do you approach who, right? And another thing, as I mentioned earlier, we make these TV commercials. And they would design the commercial, we'd go out and they would film it, and it was a very sort of engaging kind of activity that not only were they feeling good about what they were doing, and then when it's out and on TV and everybody's like, oh, you're on TV, well, that was wonderful, but at the same time, the message is getting out. From 2005 to 22, we've done so many different projects. In many cases, we're doing pure research projects. But when you're dealing with youth programs, you're not dealing with a team of professional archaeologists. And so you do have to be very realistic and honest with yourself that there are limitations to how much and what you can do. All of our research has been small scale. We would take test samples, or we would do surface collections or structural measurements and things like that. But all that data gets collected. All that data gets into our data banks for the island. One of our most spectacular projects, and this one I'm particularly pleased with because it does kind of relate to what we're talking about in this conference, is our historic trees inventory. The kids, we realized these big trees represent the perfect link between nature and culture. Some of the largest trees on our islands aren't from the islands. They're introduced species, tamarinds and things like that. So what we're looking at is how valuable these large trees are in terms of a cultural perspective. A large tree it's a landmark. Oh, you go up by the big mango and you turn left. It's a place where lovers would meet. It's a place where enslaved Africans would gather and plan strategy. But they also provide food and wood and shelter. So large trees are a singular, important element of nature that we can use as a direct link to human cultural activity and cultural heritage. Tree inventory projects were started on all 3 of the programs. We were able to get the government of St. Martin to create legislation to protect. So we now have what are called heritage trees. That's trees that at 1 meter elevation, the trunk is 1 meter wide, it can qualify. The students would go out with a GPS, take a photograph, describe the context. Is it healthy? Is it associated with ruins, such and such? And then we would take that GPS map with all those little dots of where all the heritage trees were. We turn that over to the government planning office. And at the government planning office, now that we have legal protection for heritage trees, when the developer comes and says, well, we want to develop this bay or this property, the planning office says, you've got 3 little dots on your property. Those are heritage trees. And so by notifying the developers early enough that they are going to have to deal with the heritage trees, they can adjust their plans to accommodate the trees. Now, we all recognize public health issues. Sometimes a tree does have to be lost. But at least we have made that link, and we have made the legal structures that are helping to protect them. The kids are very proud of this program. We also got the government to declare National Tree Day, National Day of Trees, because National Tree Day was flamboyant as our national tree, so it was confusing. So it's National Day of Trees. But it's March 22nd, which is the equinox. And every year we go out and we plant trees. And we try to get schools to plant trees. And we try to do tree planting. So it's finding that link. 18 years later, suffering both from the hurricanes and from COVID-19, we have gone through some problems, and yet the group maintains. We're a little smaller than we were because our new facility is not as big as the old facility, but we still maintain. And we maintain with a very diverse group because we're coming from different schools. We come from government schools, but also from private schools. So there is a mixture of students, not because of their backgrounds, but because of their interest. So some of these kids may never have actually interacted or met with each other very much in their social worlds. But through this group, they were able to come together because they all have a passion for heritage and science. And so that's why, in many cases, it was an opportunity for the kids themselves to interact with other kids of like-mindedness. We have been recognized as the official depository. We had the Caribbean Ties. I understand Caribbean Ties is coming here. It's here now. We had the Caribbean Ties exhibit come, and we set that up. Right now, I am looking for a new director. I'm going to talk about it in a minute, but I want to mention it right up front here too. We're looking for a new director. We had a young man, one of the former students. We got him a master's degree, a scholarship, sending up to New York. He got his degree. Wonderful, great. Then he met an American girl. And then he had a child, and he married her, and he never came back. Brain drain. It's very real. And it's a real problem for us in particularly the smaller islands. Because a young person, of course, wants to have the maximum opportunities for their life. And when they go to one of the big countries to get the degree, but then see all the opportunities, they very often make that decision. So we have to find ways to make it more attractive to come back. One of the ways that we hope to get more government support on this is when a scholarship is given for a degree like this, there should already be plans for a job to be available so that they can come back to that job. Now, this is and it's a pan-Caribbean problem. It absolutely is. Brain drain. And Ceiba, little Ceiba. Most of you probably don't even know much about Ceiba. It's 2,000 people that live on the top of a vertical peak of a volcano. Actually, several peaks of volcanoes, but all in one mountain. It's a very small population, but a very unique and proud group. The Ceibans are an extremely proud culture. One of the things, I just recently had a meeting, I think I mentioned here, with Queen Beatrix when she was visiting before the king took over. And I told her that, you know, we evaluate our islands based on economic levels and economic development. Why can't we evaluate our islands based on cultural confidence? Why can't we make that a factor that's included in whether or not funding, whether or not projects can happen? Not just whether it's economically viable, but whether there is a cultural confidence in the society to make it happen. And I think that's one of the points that SABARC we've been working at with there. You can see some of the different projects. Our climate emphasis project, or one of our climate emphasis projects on Ceiba, was that we have an isolated village from the 1790s way on the other side of the island. I mean, when we were doing the original work, it took a day just to hike to get there. But it's on a very steep cliff, a very, very high cliff. And literally, the ruins are falling off the cliff. The cliff is going away, and there are cisterns collapsing, and everything's just falling off the edges. So we went up there and documented everything we could so that we had at least some documentation of it before it falls off the cliff. And we also made these information signs and such. You can see the Queen there. Now, 11 years later, again, COVID, and even with COVID, we actually did some research there. It was rather bizarre because they had police escort us from, there were 3 of us doing the research, police escorted from the airplane to a room that we were going to stay at. They had cameras on the room. We could not leave the room for anything. We had to order food for food to come to the room. Every morning we were allowed to only go to our car, which had to park right in front. We could drive to the site and drive back in the afternoon and go back in our apartment. It was rather bizarre during the COVID years on trying to do archaeology, but it worked out. We have a new director. She's from Jamaica, and her emphasis is community engagement. So SABARC is also shifting from a heavy emphasis on archaeological research to the balance between archaeological research and community engagement and involvement. And so all of these institutions are now having this balance shift. Future plans, you can see there we do plan more, but of course community engagement is the projection. And 2 of the 3 board members are Saban. A lot of international connections with these 3 youth programs. We have attended most of the IACA conferences. For those of you who don't know, IACA is the International Association for Caribbean Archaeology. It took place here in 2009 at the UE. I'm president of IACA. I have been for quite some time now. We try to have it every 2 years, but we try to have it on a different island. The target for 2024 is Nevis. So we're hoping to have the IACA Congress on Nevis. We usually have from 23 to 26 countries represented. Archaeologists from 23 to 26 countries are represented. It's about 200, 250 archaeologists. Half of them are local archaeological institutions. Some of them are European and North American. Our last one last July was in Varadero, Cuba. So the idea with taking the kids there, taking the students there, was what is the best way for a young mind to understand what professionals are like in a profession? Throw you in the middle of a conference of them. Yeah, because they're going to talk shop, they're going to talk about what they're doing, and then the students really see what it's like to be an archaeologist. They hear about what's going on. So, and they not only attended, I made sure that they made a presentation. And their presentation was published in the proceedings just like all the archaeologists were. And that is a sense of pride for them as well, too. Another thing with these youth exchanges that we were working on is that I would have each of the groups go to the other island. So we would exchange among the 3 programs. And every time we would exchange, I made sure to arrange with the government that in the Parliament building itself, our Parliament building is a lot smaller than yours, but in the Parliament building itself, the kids would come in, we would have media there, and they would talk about their issues with what's happening. Climate change was one of them, but education was another one. They were saying, where's our history and our heritage in our school curriculum? Very often, up until the 1980s, a lot of the Dutch islands were still teaching primarily Dutch history in the history classes. So now we're starting to evolve and we're getting past that. But at the same time, they were asking those questions in the early period. We're there for schools, local organizations. By official decree, we are the official depository for the National Archaeological Collections. We do help the police department for forensic studies. That's mostly my work helping, but it's via CMARC. And so we do a lot of cooperation, both internationally and locally. So here's the thing. We want to talk about these heritage development models that I indicated at the beginning. What we are doing is engaging the local youth and teaching scientific method to understand about heritage. And we're ensuring that the local community is informed and involved in heritage research, and that recovering archaeological data to better understand Caribbean heritage, including assisting related government agencies and preservation of our heritage sites. That's like our little dots on the heritage tree maps, and like our measurements of ruins and such. It's not always needs to be a team of top-notch professionals to come in and measure the ruins, in particularly a situation where we need to make sure those ruins become part of the identification of the youth whose ruins heritage it represents. So why do the students see this as important? Because they believe that the Caribbean people must take more responsibility for researching their own heritage, and who better than the youth themselves. So as a summary, presented here, I'm going to talk about 3 different approaches for heritage in community and archaeology development, which have been applied in the Netherlands Caribbean, the examples I mentioned. The KHAW model has reduced archaeological fieldwork, although they've been increasing greatly in the last years, with increased focus on collections management and anthropology. The St. Eustatius model was a focus on imported field school program as a financial basis, but minimal inclusion of local participants. And then the Bonaire, St. Martin, Saba model, which focuses on youth as the means to conduct and communicate systemic field research results to the local community. So what are some benefits and deficits of these models? Well, to begin with, the first thing I mentioned earlier, brain drain. That right off the bat is one problem we confront right away. But in the KHAW model, what we see is we have a very strong community contact via the applied anthropological methods, yet with fewer archaeological collections being generated. In the Aina years, there was more emphasis on all the islands, and then in the later years, more emphasis on Curaçao. In the St. Eustatius model, it's a very effective financial planning for research work, very effective. However, the potential isolation of the research results due to minimal local participation has potential for tensions with researchers. And in the Bonaire, St. Martin, Saba model, we see that the integrated community action and involvement with research, giving strong attention to the youth. However, we could only do projects at a small scale. It would require cooperation with bigger institutions to do the work correctly. I do want to note that this evaluation, I've done this a couple of years ago, and in just the last few years, Curaçao has actually been doing a great deal more archaeological work than anthropological. So they are actually shifting in the other direction. But all of us are seeing that the balance between science and community engagement is fundamental. So there are also some global issues that NGO programs like these on a broader issues that relate to nonprofit organizations with global commonalities, which we also have to confront in the Caribbean. In the Harvard Business Review, they basically identified 4 basic questions for NGOs. Are the organizational goals consistent with its financial resources? Is the organization practicing intergenerational equity? Intergenerational equity. That's a term you don't hear very often, but it's a term we should be thinking about. Intergenerational means we've got to take the older generations and the younger generations and bring them together, find ways for both to be part of the discussion. Are the sources and uses of funds appropriately matched? And is the organization sustainable? One other thing that I found in research about NGOs and how they survive and how they work or don't work was something called the founder's effect. And unfortunately, I feel kind of a closeness to this one in some respects because I did create the 3 foundations. It's the personal passion of a founder. It's not always there in the students. And you have to try to inspire it. You have to try to bring it out. But it may never be there in the same way. So the founder has to learn to accept changes from their original goals, but the students also have to be willing to learn, participate, and feel dynamic about their participation. And this founder's effect thing really shook me up because it does signal this problem that I was having with St. Martin. I mean, we had a job. We had the young man ready. It was all ready to go. But then, where's the next one? I'm looking on the next one. Yes, we're working on the next one. But at the same time, that is something that happens, I think, in many organizations across the region. You'll get an initial person who is that motor, who is that dynamic drive to create it, to make it happen, but there's no one that really picks up the mantle in the same way. So it's good that it can go in a direction that is community-oriented and community-guided, but sometimes it doesn't go at all. Sometimes it falls. So where do we go from here? The following suggestions should be fundamental aspects of human development program, heritage development programs for each island of the Caribbean, including approaches dealing with climate change. We need some sort of, every island, this is for every island, we need some sort of heritage facility. There has to be some place where not only collections can be held, but where people can go to and say, that's our heritage place. National Trust is a good example of that here in Trinidad. We need massive increase in heritage education. It has to be introduced into school curricula that local heritage is a part of the curricula. Yeah, and including scholarships for heritage management. We don't just need scientists. We need heritage managers. So we need scholarships in that direction as well. And in fact, I'm suggesting that each island have, I call it a heritage inspector, it could be a heritage authority, whatever you want to call it, but there needs to be somebody that's the go-to person that you turn to. In your case, with the National Trust, you have a president, you have a board of directors, but you have to have somebody that is that representation for communication, not just on the island, but outside. Yet all these programs, no matter these other characteristics, all programs must include the community and youth integration. In the Netherlands Caribbean models, they were suitably created by each respective island. Yet implementation must be held accountable within international professional standards. You can't just willy-nilly take a bunch of kids and go out and start digging up a fort. You have to do it in a systematic way. You have to abide by certain regulations. But you can still take a bunch of kids and do an inventory. You can go out and do measurements. You can do work that wouldn't be compromised by the fact that they weren't professionals, but it's still the data being collected. That was the citizen scientist program that Mr. Kumar Singh was talking about. Larger scale heritage research, when desired, and in most cases it's becoming more and more common. It can be done in cooperation programs. I would strongly suggest we focus on more regional network programs. There are plenty of international connections, as we have with Leiden University or with Harvard or with different groups. But one example I want to mention today is Carabica. Carabica is the regional organization for National Archives. And there is a subgroup called CHIN, which is the Cultural Heritage Emergency Network. Now, we are honored to have one of the executive staff here, Ville Belfond, right here from the Trinidad National Archives, is on the executive board of CHIN, along with Max Skiernamek and Rita Chin Fu from Suriname, and Max is from Curacao. The thing is this organization is set up to deal with emergencies when they happen. They have containers in Curacao with equipment ready to go. If a hurricane hits, if an earthquake happens, Haiti, they're already doing it. So when something happens, they can get the call, they can throw some professionals together, get that container to the site, and start conserving and protecting resources, particularly archival and documentary resources. This kind of model, this emergency action kind of model, that might be something we want to consider into the future, because then that way we're not all trying to invent the wheel ourselves as individual islands. That way we're saving the islands as a broader community, a Caribbean community. At all times, dignity and respect are to be provided the islands in their own approaches to heritage development. And again, I want to say, even in the event of theoretical contradictions with the colonial and larger nations. That's a big statement, actually, when you think about it. Because if you run into a preservation question about should this be preserved or not, my point is it has to be equally discussed, but I believe the community should have a priority voice in what is made as a decision. Now, that's a heavy statement. It's a very heavy statement because you run into a lot of complications of what is community. Who are you consulting as community and questions like that. But I still believe that finding the balance between science and community engagement means we have to bring the community engagement element of it to an equal basis. And we haven't had that. We really haven't had that. We need that more. So with any heritage project, leadership is a primary key to success. So at least for the Dutch islands, our youth will be there with innovative new approaches as each island's heritage development confronts the challenges of climate change. And I would like to thank the Craig Group. I would like to thank the National Trust. I would like to thank University of Florida. I would like to thank the Embassy, the U.S. Embassy, all who helped with this conference. I would like to thank you very much. Now, with 4 minutes, I have two very short, two-minute little videos I'm going to show you. One of them is an example of the kids making their own commercials. And then the last one is sort of a closing thing, which is more related to climate change that I do with Greenpeace. And so, guys, you ready? So the kids one first. People of St. Martin, the youth have got something to say.
We need to scientifically research and document our heritage sites.
And we need to properly protect and store our important historical artifacts.
For both science and education.
We need to support our St. Martin Museum and our National Archives.
And introduce local culture classes in the schools.
We need to realize that our monuments have both cultural
and economic value for tourism. We need to preserve our heritage and monuments because they stand for who we are as a people.
We need to take pride in our heritage.
And learn more about our culture. And share that pride with our visitors.
We need to restore our monuments
for the next generation. It is important to understand that monuments don't have to be beautiful to be important for cultural pride.
We need to protect our heritage because it's our heritage.
It is up to every one of us to take action and save St. Martin's heritage. We can do it!
All right. And then the next one. I think that the Dutch government sees Bonaire as a little small dorpje. It concerns me that it doesn't get the proper recognition and care that it needs. I'm Dr. Jay Havisser. I've been archaeologist for the Netherlands Islands for 40 years. Bonaire is one of the last bastions of a natural, more pristine type of Caribbean life. Not just the environment, but the people as well, too. I worry about climate change because I think we are underestimating how rapidly these changes can occur. Here on Bonaire, we are a small-scale society. They're so closely tied to the environment. Bonairean culture actually is fundamentally based on the relationship with the sea. Once the sea starts changing and the environment and the coastline start changing, that's going to impact not just their general lives, but their whole life ways. And then we will have lost a true gem of understanding Caribbean people. You have the famous slave houses, and these were work sheds for the enslaved peoples who worked in the salt pans. Clearly things like the lighthouse, that's going to be impacted. There are areas where maybe we can work out systems to control the coastline. The Netherlands is famous for this. Why not use technology and awareness that they already have in the Netherlands and try to find ways to apply it here? If we don't look for ways to working together, we're not going to have as positive a future. So that is essential, figuring out a way for the Netherlands and the Bonairean people to balance that scientific approach with community engagement. And there's where you'll find a successful and sustainable future. All right. Thank you very much.
Okay. But also, can we play Corinne Wegner's video as well, if we can pull that up?
Is this her presentation? Mm-hmm. Okay. So we'll do questions after. Yeah. Okay.
Hi everyone, my name's Corey Wegner. I'm director of the Smithsonian Cultural Rescue Initiative. I'd like to thank the Craig Group and Resilient Heritage Trinidad and Tobago for inviting me to speak at this important conference today. I'm sorry I can't be there in person, but the next best thing is the video, and to understand we're going to have a live question and answer, or at least a Zoom question and answer afterward. So let me share my screen. There we go. So the title of my talk today is Breaking the Disaster Cycle, an approach to training with the Smithsonian Cultural Rescue Initiative. So for those of you who might not know as much about the Smithsonian Institution, it was established in 1864 for the increase and diffusion of knowledge by a British citizen, James Smithson, who had never even traveled to the United States. But we're very lucky that he was so interested in the increase and diffusion of knowledge and scientific research, because we have been able to build an amazing institution from that generous donation. So today we have more than 21 museums and the National Zoo, and this is both in Washington, D.C. and in other cities like New York. And then we also have more than 9 research centers at the Smithsonian. So we are in the business of both preserving America's treasures as well as advancing scientific research about our collections. In addition to the museums and the research centers and the National Zoo, we also have my office, the Smithsonian Cultural Rescue Initiative. And our mission is to protect cultural heritage threatened or impacted by disasters, and to help U.S. and international communities preserve their identities and history. We got our start in 2010 with the Haiti Cultural Recovery Project, and I'm sure many of you remember in 2010 when Haiti was hit by a catastrophic earthquake where more than 200,000 Haitians perished. There was also a lot of damage to the cultural heritage, and many institutions were available to reach out to our Haitian colleagues, and we had a direct connection with the Haitian Ministry of Culture because of their experience working with the Smithsonian on the mall during the 2004 Folklife, American Folklife event that's right there on the mall with the Cultural Heritage and Folklife Center. So we were able to work closely with our colleagues in order to try and help them both assess the damage, stabilize damage collections, and in some cases even do conservation treatment to those collections. You see here some of the colleagues we're working with. So we brought Smithsonian colleagues over to Haiti, and then with generous donations from a number of institutions, including the U.S. Department of State and others, we were able to do the work to help our colleagues with their collections. So you see here some of the work that we did. We had a cultural heritage rescue lab, and we did a number of workshops with colleagues, both from the Ministry of Culture and local organizations and arts centers. We had a number of artists come in for the workshops, and we were able to save more than 30,000 objects of Haitian art and history. And the culmination of that was the creation of a new conservation training center at KHAW University in Port-au-Prince. And you see here my boss, Dr. Richard Curran, along with our project manager, Olsen Jean-Julien, who still works with the center even today. And we've managed to work with them in a number of cases since 2010 to respond to other hurricanes and earthquakes impacting Haitian culture. So after that, we started to talk about how we might be called upon to do this kind of work better and faster in the future, and to also coordinate with the many colleagues from around the world that and at the Smithsonian that we cooperated with to respond for Haiti. And so the Smithsonian decided to create its own capability in this area. And so this is just a snapshot of the strategic plan that we created in order to try to proceed with this work. And this has kind of stood us in good stead for the last 10 years. Today, I'm mainly going to talk about disaster resilience, response, and recognition, and we'll probably leave the research off for another time. So I'd like to talk about the recognition and raising awareness part of our mission. And you see here my good colleague, Lori Foley, who works for FEMA, and together we are the co-chairs of the Heritage Emergency National Task Force. And this is just one of the ways that the United States works with both governmental and non-governmental organizations to preserve our heritage in case of disasters in the U.S. You see here the Heritage Emergency National Task Force, or what we call HENTEF, is a partnership of 60 national service organizations and federal agencies that's co-sponsored by FEMA and the Smithsonian. And our mission is to protect cultural heritage in our nation states, tribes, and local territories and local communities from the damaging effects of natural disasters and other emergencies. And so where does that fit? We're not quite governmental, and we're not quite nonprofit. The HENTEF is really a collaboration. And you see here the red organizations that you see are U.S. government organizations, and the black organizations in black type are listed are non-governmental organizations. The Smithsonian kind of falls somewhere in between. We're what's called a U.S. government trust instrumentality. So in some ways we act like an NGO, and in some ways we are able to help on the government side. So we fall under a couple of areas of the National Response Framework. You see here, the HENTEF is part of our emergency support function number 11. So this is things that the U.S. government and a number of agencies and organizations can do for disaster response in an emergency. And then we also fall under recovery support function. So after the emergency phase is over, the response phase, we also have a part to play in supporting the recovery for cultural resources in the United States. So our objectives are to provide education and training, provide technical assistance, guidance, and resources, coordinate the collection and sharing of incident-specific info, increase the incorporation of cultural and historic resources into disaster planning. I think that's the most important. It should probably be number one. And to provide information and guidance to the public. So I'm going to talk about each one of those just a little bit separately. So for education and training, one of our flagship models for that is called the Heritage Emergency and Response Training, or HEART. We hold this every year at the Smithsonian, usually with about 25 participants. And I'll talk about this in a little bit more detail, or show you some more interesting images anyway, but it's for cultural stewards, emergency planners, and first responders. And we don't just do this as a one-off. Each year we add these new participants to our list of HEART graduates, and we connect them to one another through a series of webinars, meetings, and other follow-on trainings. We also provide technical assistance, guidance, and resources in the case of an actual disaster. And we work really closely with the Department of the Interior and the National Park Service, our National Archives and Records Administration, and the Library of Congress. All of those organizations provide expertise to the U.S. government and to colleagues on the ground in the event of a disaster. And this is one of our colleagues who works in the Smithsonian Library and Archives. She's a conservator, especially focused on paper. Some of our other objectives have to do with sharing information in the preparation for and response to a disaster. So we reach out to all those organizations that are part of the HENTEF network. And for instance, right now, we sent out a big email about focused on letting our constituencies know more about what's happening with the terrible storms in California this week. This is a really important one, and this is really, if I had one thing to say about the goal of both my organization, SCRI, or the Smithsonian Cultural Rescue Initiative, and what I think our cooperative colleagues and other professionals around the world hope to achieve, it's to better incorporate cultural and historic resources and those needs into disaster planning and hazard mitigation at all levels, local, state, national, and international even. And so this is, we really find that this is something we need to raise awareness with, and this is why it's so important that we train with first responders, with emergency managers, and we also find that it's our responsibility as cultural heritage professionals to be the advocates for ensuring that cultural heritage gets included into things like disaster planning exercises, working and training with first responders and other types of emergency responders, and to promote assistance for heritage both during response and recovery. Too often we hear that cultural heritage can only be considered in the recovery phase of a disaster, and we'd like to see that change a little bit. Some more of our objectives involve providing information and guidance to the public. I'm going to talk a little bit in a minute about our Save Your Family Treasures program and some of the information that we have available for the public, and we have it listed on our website. We're about to do a brand new website, so stay tuned for that, and we'll be releasing that information widely with many, many more new resources, both for the public and for cultural professionals. So a little bit more about the disaster response. This is the colleague I mentioned earlier, who, with a whole team of individuals from the National Archives and Records Administration, from the Park Service, from the Department of Interior, we sent a team of professionals to Puerto Rico to assist. And here you see that the training involves the mitigation of mold, one of the big problems that we had in Puerto Rico and the Virgin Islands after Hurricanes Irma and Maria was the really rapid growth of mold. In the U.S. Virgin Islands, these are some images related to our salvage and immediate stabilization. And we also did a number of consultations and damage assessments during that year, during 2017, all resulting in one of the big projects that we did was to stabilize and bring back to the Smithsonian these legislative archives that you see here, which are handwritten in many cases from the 19th and early 20th century. And we've done an entire conservation of those materials. And due to COVID, it's taken longer than we hoped, but this summer, those materials will go back to the U.S. Virgin Islands for their collections there. Another disaster response that we've done was in the Bahamas. This was really, really right before COVID hit, actually, for a damage assessment mission after Hurricane Dorian. So these are some of the types of things that we bring our colleagues together to do. Our Save Your Family Treasures program, this arose out of our teams being involved in a disaster response on the ground, but also recognizing that it's not just about museums and libraries and archives and cultural institutions. The public actually has often experienced damage to their own family treasures, to their own collections. And so at the request of FEMA, we got together and created a program called Save Your Family Treasures, where we give on the ground demonstrations, and we've also done this through Facebook Live and other ways during COVID, and also when we think that it'll be faster to get that information out online. But we also try to do it on the ground in person. And here you see one of our Smithsonian staff working in a FEMA disaster recovery center, explaining how to handle, dry, and clean damaged objects, and to share tips on personal safety, prioritization, and preservation options. So we've done this in a number of places, and I'm just going to share some of our images. So sometimes it's at a disaster recovery center, or in the case, this is the U.S. Virgin Islands. We did our Save Your Family Treasures demonstrations on a few other islands at concurrently, or like on the same day, that we also did training of heritage professionals on more complex recovery and stabilization measures. But you see here a number of members of the public, and we broadcast this on radio advertisements and tried to get the word out so that members of the public could come and learn how to save their own family treasures. This is a series that we did a few years ago when we had massive flooding in the middle of the United States in Iowa and Nebraska. And here's the one that we did in Puerto Rico, which was actually, we even did this sooner than we did our heritage emergency and response training. And we had everything translated into Spanish, and we had, some of the images you saw, we have these small group situations where we do a number of trainings in different places and locations in an impacted area. In Puerto Rico, we did it at a museum where we were really able to get a large auditorium full of people and really spread the word out that way. And here's a more recent one after hurricanes and flooding in Florida. So you kind of get a sense of how we're thinking about disaster response and raising public awareness. I'd like to talk to you about resilience and training, because I think this is really where the big benefit comes. I mentioned the title of the talk is Breaking the Disaster Cycle, and you were probably wondering when I was going to get around to that. Really, I believe that this is the real key to, first of all, it's the integration of cultural heritage into thinking about disasters and thinking about preparedness, mitigation, response, and recovery, and including something for cultural heritage in every aspect of the disaster cycle. But the way you really break the disaster cycle is by preventing and mitigating the damage. So I love this saying, the cameras aren't there when we prevent a disaster, right? If you prevent, are observant while you're driving and you hit the brakes in time and you don't hit the semi truck in front of you, it's not a news story. You think, oh, I did good. I need to be more careful next time. But the reporters don't. The reporters turn out and shine the camera on you usually when something bad has already happened. So, but the real success story is if you prevent the bad thing from happening to begin with good training and mitigation. So I'd like to explain a little bit about some of the programs that the Smithsonian has done in the past and that we're doing to make that happen, and how we've created an amazing network of cultural heritage professionals, government people, international and national in the US NGOs, and really created a network of people who can help train each other, support each other, respond, and hopefully prevent and mitigate disasters from impacting cultural heritage. And this is a training that we did at the Smithsonian and also at a fire training center in Washington, D.C., working with first responders, the military, firemen, and then training a number of international cultural heritage professionals, working with our international colleagues, ECROM. But I'll tell you that the people that you see in this picture are still people that we work with even today, and this was in 2016. We also have a course called Leadership for Cultural Heritage Stewards in Challenging Circumstances, and we work with a nonprofit organization called Cultural Emergency Response, which is based in the Netherlands. And some of the people that you see in this photo are graduates of some of our other Smithsonian training courses, or they are professionals who have identified a strong leadership capacity in their fields and their countries, and they're invited to come along. This is something we do every year. This is the most recent course, and they're invited to work together. Some of them already knew each other, some of them didn't. And this also creates a strong network of people. They learn a little bit about how to hone their leadership skills, create great proposals to find donors for their work, and other strong leadership skills. And so this is the kind of the meat of what I'd really like to talk to you about, and it's our Heritage Emergency and Response Training, or HEART, as we call it. And this is our U.S. domestic training course. It's a partnership between SCRI and FEMA as part of the HENTEF. And as I mentioned earlier, our real goal is to integrate cultural heritage professionals, emergency managers, first responders, and others who get involved in a disaster situation and get them to meet each other ahead of time, not after the disaster has happened, but to meet each other and train together ahead of time. We usually do it in December each year, and we have this annual course at the Smithsonian for about 25 people. It's an open call for people to apply from across the country. And but it's not the only time we do HEART. We also do a program called Hearts on the Road, which I'm going to show you in a second. A little bit more about HEART. So it's a 1-week course, and it's all day, every day. And, you know, people are tired at the end of the day. We really work hard. There's a lot of classroom training, as you see here. We also have a number of hands-on practical exercises, all leading up to and culminating in a big disaster response exercise where we actually have to evacuate a collection. And you see here, this is an exercise at one of our buildings at the Smithsonian. So people really build on their skills day by day, learn how to work together as a team, and then they're able to do this function. So I wanted to talk a little bit more about the case study of Puerto Rico. My colleagues and I from the Smithsonian first provided emergency conservators who understand about emergency response. And some of my colleagues and I went for multiple visits, both to do that emergency help for mold mitigation and rehousing collections and other tasks, but also to work with the community, to work with colleagues from across the museum community in Puerto Rico so that they could better respond for their own collections. But understanding that this disaster was past, but there would always be the possibility of another hurricane or another disaster impacting the island, and they really wanted to create a strong team there. So we got together with management from museums and other cultural institutions across the island, and they put together a list of colleagues working in their institutions that they wanted to have this training. And so this was one of our first Hearts on the Road in Puerto Rico in 2017. We had it at the Museum of Art Puerto Rico, who kindly hosted us. They're a Smithsonian affiliated museum. And so we had a really good team of partners to work with us. And the colleagues that were selected by their institutions to participate really took the training very seriously. Many of them are skilled heritage professionals already, but what they really needed and lacked a little bit of was the meeting each other and working as a team with people outside their institution, and also working with emergency managers who were outside their institution or outside their normal everyday course of working. And so they learned really well how to work together and did a number of these same types of exercises that we do at the Smithsonian. We recreated that at the Museum of Art Puerto Rico. And as I mentioned, we also did those colleagues also helped us with the training of Save Your Family Treasures. We also did a similar program in the U.S. Virgin Islands. We did a number of consultations trying to find out what the cultural institutions thought they needed, who should participate from the various cultural institutions. And we actually did a series, because it's a little bit harder to travel between islands, and instead of bringing all the people to one place, we did some consultations and trainings on three different locations in the USVI. And you see here, we also like to have a little bit of fun as we train, but you see here we're doing that training. And people are learning how to document the items that they salvage, create a unique ID number for them, make a plan for drying and making sure that the collections are stable, and then making a plan for rehousing those collections temporarily until space can be found. You see here people salvaging out of a pool at another location and figuring out how they're going to dry that, how they're going to assign unique ID numbers to these objects, and figure out a plan for how to move forward. Many of the colleagues who've participated in Heart Puerto Rico band together, and they created a brand new NGO that has now created its own nonprofit institution in Puerto Rico, and it's called ACE Puerto Rico. And these participants have stayed together as a group. They now train together, and they've even created their own Spanish-speaking group for the training program I mentioned earlier, the leadership program. Several of the colleagues from Puerto Rico have attended the leadership program, and they now have their own Spanish-speaking alliance for heritage responders. So I think my time's just about up. I will leave it at that, and I hope to see you on the Zoom to answer any questions you may have. Thanks very much.
Okay, perfect. If there's a way that we can elevate Corinne's status to be on Zoom? She is? Okay, perfect. Thank you. So we are more than happy to take any questions that you may have. I don't know if there's any online yet. Yes. Okay. There's a microphone behind you.
Testing.
1, 2, 3.
Thank you both. I'm assuming Corinne can hear me somehow, but thank you both for the presentations. I really found them very interesting and insightful. I work for a network of national trusts, so we think a lot about how to use heritage sites and keep them alive so that people are using them all the time. And I'm really interested in this community-centered approach to archaeology, which I think is fantastic in the moment of doing the research. I'm curious about how you see what's the best use of an archaeological site in the long run for a community?
Very good question. There are a wide variety of archaeological sites. Of course, anything over 50 years old for most governments qualifies as archaeological. So a lot of times what you're dealing with is not this uniform statement that, oh, archaeological sites can be used for this. It depends on each particular site. A pre-Columbian, for example, an Amerindian site that is almost exclusively underground, that's not going to be a high visibility type of site, yet it can have a high value of spiritual recognition, a sense of place, ancestry, and such. So it is the way that the different types of sites, for example, on Bonaire, when we did the World War II Heritage Park, it's an archaeological emphasis type of park, but it's dealing with a time period that there are still living residents that remember the time period. So it depends on the type of site. So how archaeology and archaeological sites can be utilized further, it's going to depend on the types of sites, will require different approaches. I think the bottom line, and again I'll go back to the Tanque Maraca, the World War II site in Bonaire, it's not so much about, or it's not, it is about what the topic of the site is, but it's also about how the community feels about that site. What is their identification with that site? It has taken quite a long time, for example, for some of the islands which haven't had indigenous populations for hundreds of years, for that time period to be ignited with inspiration within the community. It takes a little time. It takes time to educate about what the value of that site, to create that ancestral value of that space. Whereas a site like the Tanque Maraca, that's in living memory. A lot of times when doing education with these sites and trying to develop the site's value, it's very important to bring out objects that people identify. I'm doing a project right now in Saint Martin where we had an old cistern near the original airfield that was built in the World War II period. And during the project, in a trash pile nearby, we found this gigantic metal object. Couldn't figure out what it was. And then I started asking the elders in the village, Simpson Bay Village, and they said, oh, that's the pull scraper that they pulled behind a tractor to build the airport. So what we did was we pulled it out of the trash pile, cleaned it up, put it up on pillars with an information sign saying this actual object was the object used to build the first airport. But it was Simpson Bay people who built it, who drove that tractor, and who built that airport. So it not only becomes a representation of the developmental phase of introduction of an airport, it's about the participation of that community's members in that event in St. Martin's history.
Thanks.
Perfect. Yes.
Thank you very much, Jay. I'd like to start with if everybody's really listening to you and listen deep in terms of what you're saying, because you're talking about people, and that last one about dignity and respect, about people and community, it starts there.
Yep.
Because a lot of us as professionals, a lot of us as technocrats, may come from a quote-unquote educated platform and are talking for people, a possession of people. Same way you said the foreign researchers, we in the Caribbean will know this well. The foreign consultant, the foreign researcher comes in and tells you what to do or what is the priority. And to use the words of Robert Nesta Marley, emancipate yourself from mental slavery starts with understanding yourself and also respecting a community. Because we may go to university, we may go to technical training, but we don't necessarily listen to the people in our community. And even within our National Trust community, or even our heritage community, we not necessarily listen to the people on the ground and their voices. Even Trinidad and Tobago per se, without a technical review, how much of our sites really represent the community in terms of the differentiation, in terms of equity, and who's left out. Those are important to look at, and it jumps into archaeology too. So that's a comment overall. I like to really us to reflect and understand the ethics of our professional practice, to be able to listen and to recognize community and whose community we listen to. And the same way we might think about big monumental buildings and our colonial heritage past, etc., as the parity of what heritage is to keep above water. But the same way the community tree, the community standpipe, the liming spot on the corner is our heritage. And we have to look at both tangible and intangible heritage. It's so important because it ties into how we value. It comes back to the end point of this conference, how we value and how we act in terms of value. So this comes to my question. What you're seeing, and I could talk from a country that's just celebrated 6 years independence, versus countries that's still in the Caribbean who are colonial. And you said, you had a loaded question, you said, we have to really consider our political mindset also. The question I have is, you invested 40, 30 years, how much that mindset, how are you dealing, or how are we transforming mindset to recognize the community in your practice? And how did that light really start? Because I don't know if you started off with that perception that we have to talk to community first, or you solely transformed as you got through your projects. And again, could you reinstate again how important it is to really, or the methodology, how to listen to people and community? Thank you. It's kind of convoluted, but you understand it comes to the 4 points.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
But as Caribbean people, we need to understand and work together.
And I think that one of the things you touched on there that's really critical, and it's the perspectives and sensitivities. The case study that I just mentioned on St. Eustatius, where there was the removal of enslaved Africans, the community felt an enormous, both emotional but also identification with this site, with these skeletons. Whereas in Holland, the burial of your deceased members, they go into a grave, and after 25 years, they're taken out of the grave and somebody else gets buried in there and they're just removed. So there is a fundamentally different perspective sometimes. And what we have to make sure is that the researchers who are in the context where those sensitivities are not only valid, they are essential, that researcher needs to be aware of what they are doing when they're dealing with that kind of context. So that I hope approached some of the issue about different perspectives and how we've got to, I honestly think there should be educational programs for researchers before they even come. On what are the sensitivities? What are things that they have to pay attention to? In my own personal experience, I government for a long time doing government archaeology. I was just pure science, doing, basically telling people what was a good idea to research. And then there was that case that I mentioned earlier where I was saying this and they kept saying, no, there's this village from the 1920s up in the hills and we really want to know. And that's when the light went on. And I realized that the perspectives of their sense of ownership of their island and their heritage depends on them following their sense of feeling for these sites. If they don't have a feeling for the 4,000-year-old skeleton, it's still scientifically important to research, but it doesn't necessarily have to be the first priority for the researchers. It should get done, but it should be listening to where are those sensitivities of the community. One of the biggest problems that I'm seeing after these 40 years in these programs is that who is community? Mm-hmm. When you say, oh, we talked with community, does that mean you had a town hall meeting and you told them something and that was it? And a few expats came and that was it? No, it means going out, and that's what I like what Corinne was doing. They're going into the different communities. You didn't just go to one island in VI, you went to all three of the islands. You went into the barrios in Puerto Rico. That's the only way you're going to get a real perspective. Because there's another side of the coin. Heritage research in a historical perspective has the contact with community has been dominated by the political decision makers who are going to make something from it. They're either going to make political gains or financial gains. And so often the scientists, the researchers, were kind of isolated in the early years to only dealing with those groups. They didn't have to deal with the people, they just had to deal with the decision makers who would sign the permits. And we've got to realize that that doesn't always represent community. But neither does, for example, some radical group, and it could be any range of radical groups who has a very radical perspective. They are to be listened to, but it doesn't mean they represent the community voice. And so it's a very delicate balance, and that's why we need more Antillians to be the researchers. And that's the overall goal of my programs. We need more Antillians to become the scientists themselves.
Mm-hmm. Good. I think we have one more question, and then we'll go to lunch.
Thank you. But he spoke concerning sensitization. And
about what? I think it comes from this end, no?
He already touched on sensitization and involvement in community, and that is where I was going. And who really, what type of consultation that they really have with community people based on what is going to happen and that will impact their lives, preserving the culture and how the restoration is going to take place. They having a voice. The politicians make the decisions and economically it is working for them. But is it really working for the community people, the persons that actually living in that environment and the situation? And is it that you're really giving them a voice when you talk about consultation that goes one way, not both ways? So that is my biggest concern.
Yeah, and I think your point is very well made, that it's not just for the scientists to be telling the communities about what's going on. It's for the communities to also be telling the scientists what's going on. That's why this whole approach to climate change and the inclusion of traditional knowledge is absolutely essential. It has to be part of the discussion. Because a lot of our science right now, I'm a little concerned, this whole conference is making us all a little bit more sensitive to the concerns about the fact that our very models that we use as scientists, if it keeps changing as rapidly and as dramatically as it does, we won't be able to use models anymore. It's as Mr. Kumar Singh said, you got to deal with the problem as it hits you. And that's a very dangerous approach. So we have to be aware that traditional knowledge does have a lot to offer and contribute to our awareness, particularly when our scientific models might actually be running into some problems. Mm-hmm. So, and then there's the classic examples you always hear in hurricane disaster. We'll have that little small wooden channel house that was built 150 years ago. It survives. But this modern thing right next to it, gone. And it's because they're using pegs in the assembly of the wood structure. And the pegs allow the structure to give and move and deal with the wind. You put nails, nails will pull out. You put block, it falls over. It's too rigid. So we can learn a lot about adaptations. But then there is a science side of it too. We were also hammered with Irma and Maria. And after the storm, we went out and we're looking at the damage. And one thing we identified really quickly is that by far most, of the roofs that were lost, the beginning of the loss of the roof is a squared corner of a building. A square building, when wind hits it at height, creates a vortex. And that vortex lifts, and it takes the corner, it beams out, and then you lose your roof. If we were to adapt and make more rounded corners on our buildings, we might be able to alleviate a lot of roof loss. So little insights like that. Yeah.
Okay, and I lied. We have one more question from over here, if you would like to.
Lisa? Was it Lisa?
No.
Oh, oh okay.
It's okay.
Hearing? Yes. Corey said that long after the cameras have left the community, it's the community that are building resilient. They're mitigating or they're responding. As soon as a disaster hit, it's not Red Cross or Habitat for Humanity, who I represent today, that responds. It's the neighbor next door that comes to the rescue. We underestimate the voice of the community. We underestimate the power. We underestimate the knowledge that resides in the community. The best historians, not the people in Harvard, is a little old lady under the tree that can tell you stories of her grandmother who had a bridge that existed here and a waterway that existed there, and the flood that came and took it, and what has happened. And we can document evidence from within the community. No longer Habitat builds for communities, we build with communities. And that's the power of understanding what exists in the various communities. And if we're going to talk resiliency and resilient heritage and climate change adaptation, the first persons that we need to think and take into consideration is the people in our communities. And when we say no one left behind, we have to start with putting those people first. When we design, we have to design with them. We need to respect their cultures and take into, as someone just said, their own way of doing things and incorporate it into our designs. Because if for hundreds of years they've done things resiliently, why do we want to come with our intellectual whatever to change those things? That's why sometimes we cause the confusion that we do. And so I just want to endorse what you're saying, Dr. J. Our communities, they have the power and the knowledge. Perhaps they don't have the resources and the level of education that we are exposed to. So the combined resources can definitely take us into the next century if we are going to exist beyond 2050.
Thank you.
Perfect. Thank you. And I believe we are ready to go to lunch.
Thanks, Kim.
Yeah.